Hello, friends, and welcome to the Games UX podcast.
A show that explores the world of user experience research in video games. My name is Leonard Nacker, and together with my co-hosts Anders Drachen and Pejman Mirza Babai, we edited the book on games user research. This podcast covers pretty much everything we couldn't fit into the book. Find out more about us on gerbook.com or grab the book from Oxford University Press.
Welcome back! Another episode with your favorite game UX professors. We're just gonna assume that you like us. See, I got this new toy. This is a little, what do you call it? A Koopa. And you can hit it a bunch of times until you get an extra life. Now that is some serious gameplay that's happening in my office. But we want to talk about something much more technologically challenging that's happening with a lot of game development and specifically machine learning and artificial intelligence these days. How are we using these tools, these AI tools, to create better games? And of course, games have used AI for quite some time. We've seen AI or games as a playground for AI, but now AI has found its way into user research. We're going to have to start thinking about how AI and specifically machine learning and generative AI and these kind of things that you hear about when you hear about ChatGPT and other text-based AIs and large language models that are taking over the public discussion. And we want to think about how can we use these things in user research in video games today. And unfortunately, Anders is a little bit sick today. Otherwise, I'd be like, he knows a lot about this data. And I just pass the question on to him. But I don't know if you want to start or if Pejman wants to start with that. But I think my first question is, how do you know, what examples do you know of how AI and machine learning is used in user research in video games today? Who wants to start?
I can start probably.
Okay.
So yeah, interesting topic. And I guess to start, I'm going to talk about some of the projects we are working on. I think I got interested in this topic. I think back in 2018, we wrote an article, like a blog post actually, about, I think we call it player-less playtesting. And then the idea was that we could use AI to simulate player behavior and then use those data, those simulated data, to get an idea on how a real player may have interacted with our game. So that's how we started. Mostly was the idea that we thought it just interesting. At the time, no one really cared about this topic much. I remember I got a bunch of interest from some people. The question was like, do you think it's actually possible? And then we did some prototypes and we showed that it's actually possible. And now it's actually a super popular topic and many companies work on that. My interest always is less on the machine learning aspect of it, but what I would say maybe like a stick-based decision making for those simulated player basically. So what we did, we basically built a tool that we tell the players, the AI players, how to behave based on our knowledge from the human behavior and psychology. And then basically our argument was that this could be used earlier on in development process before we actually have a game or a prototype that's ready for real player engagement. And I think the reason that this might be quite interesting is that for players to experience the game in a way that the designers intended, we need certain level of fidelity, both in terms of the content, in terms of interaction, in terms of the arts and graphics. But then on a kind of a basic level, when we have this simulated player through AI, they don't really care about the art, for example. If you just define an object as a tree or an object as an enemy, they just gonna interact with them without thinking that, okay, does this look something that I want to interact with? So like my argument was it could be used early on in the development process before we actually put loads of resources into to have a polished content. But this is, as I said, based on my personal experience. That project that we had then changed to assessing difficulty level through the use of AI. We are now looking at balancing economy through the use of AI. There are loads of potential in this space, and it's quite an exciting time to actually work in this domain.
I think you're right. And I think one of the things that we're starting to see is the space of personalization. As some of you might know, we've done a lot of personalization for gamification, specifically with Hexat and other questionnaires, where in the past we've used personality questionnaire, personality assessments to help personalize experiences that even go beyond gaming. But I think really, and this was actually some of the recent work that we did as well, we tried to personalize the experience based on the player input. This was a sort of an automated Hexat questionnaire. So based on the clicks in the game, we were trying to personalize that experience. And I think that is what we're seeing happen more and more. People are using using player data to identify patterns and trends, and then feeding that to their algorithms to help them create or adjust the game elements and create these interactive things. And difficulty adaptation is something that we've seen as well. This is, of course, not something that happens at the user research level, but you can just imagine how a user researcher might also over time have to think about like what would a good difficulty adjustment look like? How can I feed that into it if it's not fixed, if it's not on a linear level or a predefined level, but now it's a fluid level. So it makes the user research much harder because now I have to think about this dynamic adaptivity that needs to happen here. And how can I test for that? How can I gather that data? And specifically when we're talking about personalization, we can't personalize for everybody because that would mean we would have to actually test with everybody, with every player in the game. And that would be very difficult, right? We usually get an audience segment or we get the main target audience and we test with that main audience. And then we could create some suggestions for personalization for that audience. But really, to do this large-scale pattern matching, we're going to have to use in-game analytics. We're going to have to use data that we generate as people are playing these games over time. And that's the same way that we've done large-scale data analysis, and Anders knows much more about that than I do. But over time, a lot of games, as they go into a franchise and they create more and more games of a similar type, they generate heaps and bounds of data that you can then use to improve the next iteration of that franchise. The game becomes a data generation machine as well, and that helps personalize and adjust a lot of these experiences. I don't know if you're feeling happy to chime in there, but you don't have to, Anders. Just if you wanted to add something to that, go ahead.
I'll of course tout the horn of games data science or game analytics at any point, right? We can argue where user research stops and data science starts and blah, blah, but I would say user research encompasses everything we do as long as we are focused on the players, right? Meaning that most companies will harvest data about how people play their games and use that to improve those games and to inform the construction of future titles. And it's also very useful for things like personalization, where we're essentially running, again, you can argue whether it's machine learning or AI, whatever, let's call it machine learning models that operate in real time as the games are being played to make sure that our economy is balanced, that we drive the right types of monetization offers, that we encourage people to play in a non-toxic manner. There can be all these purposes for these models to adapt the experience or the way that the game is being played, which is about a lot more than just dynamic difficulty adjustment, which is one of the first places where we really started using in-game behavioral telemetry to try and make sure that we keep people in that magical and somewhat mythical flow zone, right? And so these days, machine learning is used extremely heavily across all aspects of the process, and we are more and more seeing the combination of data science, machine learning, AI, and more traditional user research, user testing being combined for the simple reason that looking at large-scale behavioral telemetry data, we can say something about what people do, but we can only draw inference as to why. It's the old hypothesis testing problem, right? If we actually want to know why people do things, and if we really want to know why, not just guess, we have to talk to people. We have to do lab-based testing, right? That's the only way that we can test hypotheses. And that's why we really need both. We need both of these aspects. As tempting as it is to drive all decisions and build all our systems based on large-scale behavioral telemetry and AI, we also need to talk to people.
Totally, yeah. And I think that's, when we're talking about talking to people, that's also where we can leverage some of these strengths that generative AI gives us when we're collecting player feedback, right? And so I do think I want to talk a little bit, and maybe Pershman has some ideas there, about automated surveys that essentially adapt based on answers. And this is coming from an idea that I got, I think when I was looking at it, I think it was user testing or one of the larger user research companies, where you can see that they're now offering these semi-structured interview question generators where you have your key question, you start the interview, and it will generate the follow-up questions based on the interview that you're having. And of course, you could do that in real time as you're transcribing audio data. I don't know if it does that, but you could. As you're transcribing the audio data, you could then be like, okay, this is the text content, hit the button, generate a follow-up question based on what the participant just said, and it helps you drill down deeper into the area that you might want to find out more about. But I also wonder how it works on a survey level. If we're not there, if we're not doing the interview, you could, of course, dynamically generate the triggers and switches in the survey. Any thoughts about that, Pejman?
I personally haven't used the services you are talking about, so I don't know. But if you think of, let's say, a user research process, or let's say playtesting, to be more specific, a playtesting process. So there are a number of things we do before we conduct the session that includes designing the study, figuring out the question we want to ask, but also things such as let's find participants who is suitable for this. And then, so that's the stuff that happened before, the stuff that happened during as we run the study, like the data collection piece, and then the steps that happen after. So how we analyze the data, what are the important things, generate that, make that presentation. And then, so if we think of it as maybe three separate steps or stages, then we can think about maybe it can contribute. What you mentioned makes sense in terms of maybe provide the initial suggestion of survey question or interview question for the earlier stage. I've used some tools. I think that it helps. I think some form of AI or machine learning probably that helps with recruitment. So it looks at your requirement and it shortlists based number of participants for you based on their experience, based on their participation in previous studies. So there are some automation going on, especially if you are working with agencies that have thousands of people in their database. Selecting the 5 that matches best for your requirements or the 10 that matches best for your requirement, that's really time-consuming task that could be automated with that. Then I think the other part, obviously, I've seen loads of application is in reporting. So whether tools that helps us to either transcribe, analyze, and then summarize, I actually find them quite effective in doing that. And then heavily improving like the speed of making presentation, finding, let's say, even creating images and things like that can support some of the thoughts, analyzing the video. We actually probably use some of those in generating this podcast series as well, like in terms of helping with like selection of videos and transcribing them and things like that. So to summarize, like there are loads of tasks that could be done more effectively and efficiently using these new technologies.
What I would like to see a generative AI model trained to do, I would love to see a generative AI model that could take the outputs of user research and translate that output into a language, style, and ideally graphical format that would suit all the different stakeholder audiences that actually need those outputs. Because one of the central challenges, one of the things we always talk about in the game research community is reporting the results of user testing, or for that matter data science, game analytics. How do we report it in such a way that all the different stakeholders that we're dealing with across the disciplinary game company, that they can utilize it and drive action from it? Because those are two massive challenges, right? How do we communicate and how do we drive action? I want to see a startup company build a generative AI model that can do that. That would be amazing. That would be extremely helpful. But to go back to the AI generated on the fly survey idea, which I think is fascinating, and I can definitely see the use for this in studies, in remote studies also, is a bit of a pain point for us in general. But obviously, utilizing this kind of a personalized model, it might give us deeper insights, just like a lot of qual methods do compared to quantitative methods or qualitative measures and quantitative measures. Sorry, but it will of course come at the cost of being able to correlate across different surveys. If we don't use standardized surveys across all participants, we can't do statistics on those answers. But I am wondering whether an AI and a tool that can adapt, consider whether that wouldn't be extremely useful exactly to help us with the often very expensive, painful process of getting a lot of feedback. And there are a variety of sort of research projects around topics like games and well-being that could really benefit from these kinds of systems.
Yeah, I think that's great, but I do want to chime back into the first thing that you said about what if a startup built this tool. And I do think it is already pretty close with advanced data analysis mode that you can select. The capabilities, as long as you know the stakeholder audience, to feed it data and say, okay, I need to present this data to this particular audience, create the visualization in the style of X. It will do all of that for you and will create actually amazing charts. But the downside is no developer will use it because of data breach, right? You would need to have something that is more at the corporate level that allows you to maintain the data on site and not feed it back to OpenAI or whoever is the provider of the AI solution that you have. So right now they're not very useful, even though the capability capabilities are there of some of these tools, but they're not very useful for developers because they can't really leverage them in the way that they would want to, because the draconian NDAs and privacy issues that we have in the games industry. So they pretty much have to build it in-house or license something that would allow this to not be breached or not be operated outside of their own servers, right? Yeah. And then I think technology-wise, we're pretty much there. We just need to find something that is secure and works for different games companies to actually make sure that is created. But yeah, would be a super powerful tool if it was deployable in a games context.
I'm perhaps a bit more skeptical about how ready ChatGPT is right now for this kind of task, but I can see what you mean. I also think,
have you tried the advanced data analysis? Have you tried it?
But communication and enabling people to take action is a task that goes way beyond just creating different charts. Let's not dive into that. But again, whether you're trying to communicate with an artist or an engineer or an executive, or a marketing researcher or a lawyer, your legal team, there are so many different languages and terminologies and ways that we view the world that I think we need something deeper. But again, I can definitely see the idea there, right? There's also all this kind of stuff like it's really useful to have a designer observe a PlayStation as a lot of our people our colleagues have been talking about in the past, right? But I think you're really you were saying something very important when you're talking about ethics, because you're absolutely right that we cannot just feed player data into generative systems that are open. There are a lot of legal frameworks out there to prevent this, at least here in Europe with the GDPR framework. The new EU AI Act also has a very interesting take on data protection and privacy and the kinds of checks and balances, etc., that we need to put into various types of AI systems depending on their risk level. I can really recommend anyone watching this to take a look at the AI Act. It's a very interesting take on like how do we categorize systems. I don't agree with everything that's in there, but it's nice to see policy being proposed that's fairly broad, right? But a model that is developed in-house and where we control the input and the output, and systems like that in existence now, large banks that train their own internal systems, etc. We could definitely use something like that, especially in the confines of sort of large developers or publishers, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that was a little bit of a segue from where we were originally at. So I do want to bring this back a little bit to this idea of user research, and specifically the idea of how can we leverage it in the space of user research. We were talking a lot about game data, but what about user communication data that happens in the surrounding spaces of games, such as social media and forums, where we can leverage the language analysis capabilities that some of these AI models have? And of course, there's different ways that we can look at that for sentiment analysis, for finding pain points and patterns and other stuff. Any thoughts on anyone about that? Like I maybe want to start by saying that sentiment analysis is the easiest thing to do. That's been around for the longest time to find out how people feel about the product, in this case, the game, what features they like. So you can do a post-game analysis by how people talk about your game. It can help you identify the positive and the negative and the sentiments that users express towards your game. Of course, that works for any product, but as reviews are quite powerful as drivers of revenue for video games, and they can really make a big difference in how well your game does commercially. So I think it is a good way to analyze these text-based tools to really get deeper insights in understanding what people like or dislike about the game. Any other thought on that from you?
I've seen it's quite popular. A couple of companies I know of that they offer that service generally for any product. So you could basically tell them your product, couple of key terms that you are interested in, and then they basically search everywhere for any mention, and then they summarize it, which I think is quite impressive. So I would think, especially with games and the change in the business model, kind of free to play or games as a service, I think while you have that for the product out there as a service, I think it's really important to be able to have an understanding of how your users are talking about your product. The other application that I think it's important is the first one I talk about is for a live product that you have out there. The other one that I think there is a potential is for at the ideation stage. So you have an idea of a game that you want to develop, and I think it's critical to understand what are people saying about that genre. Is that actually like a commercially viable? What are the key features that people like? Let's say if you are developing a new, let's say first-person shooter game, what are the key features people talk about from other titles? What sort of a quality threshold you need to meet. And then there are obviously like loads of places to search for these, such as different sites that talk about review, particularly like Metacritics and things like that. If there were a way to condense this and then say, okay, now you are building this new game for this genre, here are what you need to care about. And I think that would be quite useful for developers.
Yeah, I think it's genre, but it's also really, even before you find a genre, just see what the public taste is also. What does the public currently want in that gaming space? And maybe even just going through Twitch streams and analyzing some of the feedback from certain game genres and Twitch streams. If somebody wants to create a competitor to League of Legends or something like that, to see what the streamers are talking about and what the pain points of the audience are, to see, okay, can we find something in that space that actually works? So yeah, I think you're right. It can really, and that's almost like market research, right? It's helping game companies do that type of market research that then later becomes user research as the game is being developed and the prototypes being tested. But it can be really powerful to look at that. And I think it goes beyond, at the beginning, we could use the AI tools to classify games, genres, pain points, these things. But I think it goes even further. As we're developing the game and this market research turns into user research, we could then in the same way see what are the features that should be given the best priority and what are the ones that should be given the lowest priority. And developers are already doing that in larger scale beta testing, where a lot of the forum responses are being, I think in a lot of the cases, that stuff's still hand sorted, but I think a lot of them are using data clustering tools and other things to find out what's the most talked about feature, what's the most complained about feature, how can we prioritize what feature to work on as you go through these later in the development life user testing stages. And it really helps you get a point on that UX. It's almost like it's not a new method, but it's almost like an unprompted mix between an interview and a user observation, because you're not really observing the user, you're just observing how they talk about the product as they're engaging with it, and you're not prompting them anything, you're just seeing in the forums how they naturally talk about it. So I think there's benefits to that sort of, let's say it, fly on the wall method, just observing how people are chatting about your game and what they're bringing to that conversation. I think that's quite powerful. Any other thoughts on that? Because I know we're getting close to wrapping up soon, but any other thoughts on that? Do you feel like there's huge benefits? And we already talked about a lot of the benefits, but huge benefits to user research? Because I know a lot of user researchers on LinkedIn are very reserved about the use of AI, and they feel maybe it infringes A, on scientific validity, and B, on the ability to get insights from data, because that is something that user researchers are very proud of, that they can generate that insight. And if an AI comes along and says, hey, I can generate the same insight, that would be very troublesome for a job.
That is, every tool we have in our toolbox comes with certain strengths and like limitation and edges. And to me, this is another tool. It may not work for certain situation. It may work for certain situation. I think we already talked about, like when we are talking about focusing on user data, there are loads of ethical consideration. Are you even allowed to put players' comments on one of these systems? And so there are loads of consideration, and I could see why in some companies or some people may not want to use it. And again, it's also very similar to many other tools that we are using. So understanding those and then deciding what works for each individual situation, I think that's quite important. The other thing to consider is, I think this is a rapidly changing environment, and obviously we didn't talk about everything in half an hour or so. So there are loads of researchers, there are loads of articles, loads of interesting discussion that's happening. Basically every gaming conference I attended in the last couple of months, there were a number of panels on this topic. So it's obviously an interesting topic. It's very important to at least be aware of what's going on, rather than just say, okay, I don't care about this, don't talk to me about this topic. Just know what's going on and how it may be useful to you. And then it doesn't mean that everyone should use it, but there could be situations that could be helpful.
I think you were putting it very right there, Pitsman. Machine learning AI, generative AI, whatever we choose to call getting computers to solve problems for us, it's a tool. There are certain things that those tools are good at. There are certain things those tools are not good at, because they're assigned to solve particular types of problems. And arguably with generative AI, we've gotten some very interesting new capacities in connection with the games, right? The creation of AI characters that can communicate more broadly than what we might have been able to previously, without having to pre-script everything. More dynamic systems, automatic creation of assets, more procedural content generation, better AI-driven playtesting, etc. But at the end of the day, we still need the focus groups and the playtest in the lab, right? Because we need to communicate with the players. And as much as we can gather data from online forums and the internet and games, and they will always be from certain segments of the audience. And we need to speak to all the segments, also those that are not active on the forums, right? This is old wisdom now, right? But there are some. The next few years will be really interesting for our field. It's going to be interesting seeing how things will change.
I agree. Those were good words to come to the close of today's podcast. We want to thank everyone for tuning in. Thanks both of you for providing your insights. We're always really excited if people take the time to engage with us. So we do want to thank you for listening, and we do want to remind you that it is really helpful for the visibility of the podcast if you give it a 5-star rating on your preferred podcast platform, whether that is Apple or Google or Spotify. Actually, Google is phasing out, so it probably would be Apple or Spotify these days. Wherever you're listening to us, we do appreciate the feedback, the comments, and the ratings. It really helps us. And if you're a YouTuber, then follow us on YouTube. Check out some of the shorts that we did. Comment on this episode on YouTube. And we're really happy to provide this information to you, and we're looking forward to your feedback. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
This was another episode of the Games UX podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Check out the Games User Research book with a blue cover published by Oxford University Press, the only research-backed book out there that provides an authoritative overview of UX research in games. Reading it will accelerate your growth as a game UX researcher so that you can achieve better results faster. Thank you to everyone leaving those 5-star ratings for the book on Amazon. Hey, even if you're not a games user researcher, our book will provide an instant opportunity for you to get an overview of the UX in games. Check out Games User Research on Amazon.com. Send us your feedback anytime to editors@gerbook.com, and see you in our next episode.